Hey, it's Tony Burke, the Arts Minister. I was asked to give a bit of a summary of a lot of what we've done over the last 3 years, and I got from the department this long list of this measure, how much money, this measure, how much money. And yes, there's a lot of additional money we've put into the portfolio, but what I'd like to do in the few minutes I've got is give you a bit more of a sense of structurally what we've changed, because that's the really big shift I think that we've made over the last 3 years. So the context of the last 3 years, of course, was what came before, and that was the pandemic. And during that time, the arts sector just took such a hit. Every part of the economy took a hit, and I remember arguing really strongly that we needed wage subsidies, but if you wanted a wage subsidy designed to exclude as many arts workers as possible, you would have designed JobKeeper the way it was. And so people were already in a sense of weakness ever since the Brandis cuts that had happened years before that, and then the pandemic hit. So it was in that context when we wanted to get cultural policy up and running really quickly that a couple of things changed. The first was the title of it became Revive. We were wanting to have a cultural policy that wasn't, if you look at the Creative Nation from Paul Keating or Creative Australia from Julia Gillard, they were both cultural policies that purported to be permanent. That's what it was going to be from then on. Here we needed something that was specifically designed to help get the sector back onto its feet. That's why it was called Revive, and also why it was said to only be the cultural policy for 5 years, because I wanted to make sure it was clear that we needed to come back to this after we'd gone through the first phase of reform. The big strategic shift we made was in what happened with Creative Australia. And that's where previously you had the Australia Council looking after government-funded art, and then you had creative partnerships looking after the philanthropic sector, and then commercial basically had no one looking after it. It was on its own. The idea of Creative Australia was to bring all that together, because it's the same audience and the same workers as well. So you'd have one place that had to look at government-funded, philanthropic and commercial funding, providing all of the policy guidance for that. Now, to do that, we brought the Brandis cuts back, created a few extra concepts in terms of works of scale, but then established 4 bodies, 2 for contemporary music and for writing, 2 areas that had been neglected basically because they were seen as largely commercial, and to have a real focus on them. Another body, First Nations, a First Nations board reflecting the first pillar of cultural policy being First Nations first. And that was to make sure that for First Nations art and First Nations arts workers, you didn't just have additional funding, you also had a level of autonomy where you would have a First Nations board making decisions on First Nations art. And finally, of course, we had the challenges for artists being treated as workers. It had never occurred to me. I'd always made the argument about the arts. I'd always sort of put the economic argument to one side and tried to focus on the intrinsic beauty and intrinsic merit of art. And I discovered during the pandemic, a whole lot of people just had this view, including some pretty powerful people, that working in the arts wasn't a real job, that somehow it was just a hobby. And then we also had a series of stories of people at workplaces being treated in ways that no one should be treated at any workplace. I was, as you know at the time, Minister for Workplace Relations as well, but I knew the complexity of this industry. For some people, the workplace relations systems are really neat fit, but for a lot of people it's not. You might be a contractor, but it's not the contract of someone contracting and giving you money always. It might be you contracting and paying a venue and then trying to get your money back when you're raising money through tickets. It can be a whole lot of complex relationships, working in one city for a couple of nights and then on the other side of the country the next week. And our workplace system just didn't look or really appreciate the circumstances you were working in. So that's why we established creative workplaces as well, and there was no one better to put in charge of that than Kate Jenkins. So that was the structural shift of creative workplaces. Now, overarching all of that, and I referred to the Brandis cuts before, but it wasn't just a cut. It was a different approach of a minister. It was a minister saying that the minister should be in charge of decisions about artistic merit. I've got a really strong view that that's not the case. And I am completely aware, obviously, of all the discussion that's happening now about decisions of Creative Australia, both in who it's chosen for different contracts, and then obviously when those contracts have been terminated. What I want to make clear though is I reject completely the view that the minister should be making those decisions, or when the minister doesn't like or likes decisions, that they should somehow be rewarding or punishing members of the board. You do any of that, you're straight back to the Brandis days. And for any of the challenges of arm's length funding, can I just say every alternative is worse. Every alternative is much worse. And having seen what happened during those years, I have a passionate commitment to the independence of Creative Australia. Absolutely passionate. And those decisions should be made at arm's length, and ministers shouldn't be interfering or making judgments about them after the event. Now, what we've done with respect to Creative Australia isn't the only sort of shift we've made. There's a few areas where technology got ahead of us and the law hadn't caught up. I predicted back in 2013, I used very clumsy language, but I talked about the fact that people would be watching the internet through their TV and we needed to do something about Australian content. I was a pretty lone voice back then, and over time, various interests have happened and we've had the interaction of free trade agreements as well. But it's the reason why I'm a passionate believer in making sure that our quota system applies to streaming services. We haven't been able to land that yet. My determination to get there remains completely unchanged. I wish we'd landed it. I thought we would have by now. But my determination to get there is based on the same defence of any Australian quota system. You know, we have a natural challenge in Australia where we speak the English language and we have huge competition from other English language producers of dramatic content that can find its way straight across the internet to Australia. I don't want us to lose the capacity to see Australian stories and see ourselves reflected. You know, sometimes one of those stories will make a huge amount of money, and that's great. And a quota system will help facilitate that, but sometimes they won't. And that's okay too, because the person sitting on the lounge has a right to know that the stories that they watch, that some of them will speak very personally to them. And in other areas, quota systems have been the way that we've done that. I still want to find a way for us to do that on the streaming services. That's not the only area, of course. We also have something as simple as every time you borrow a book from the library. Since Gough Whitlam, the author has received a royalty for that. But then when we switched to ebooks, an ebook wasn't covered. And so authors have been missing out on income. But we've now updated the laws to make sure that that happens. Artificial intelligence, there's work being done right now, but can I say, I don't think that work will ever stop. We're going to need to keep making sure we keep up. There will be artists who use artificial intelligence. There already are. It's not the technology that's a threat, but certainly at the moment, theft of art is a threat. And we're seeing that happen with artificial intelligence, and we need to make sure that our laws can keep up with those challenges. Digital games do something very similar to what we've always had policies for the screen industry. But the old Digital Games Fund that I established back in 2013 had disappeared. Now we've got new laws catching up with some of the benefits that are there for the rest of the screen industry for digital games, as well as some direct funding. There's one, and I said I wouldn't talk about all the different funding projects, but can I just talk about one thing we've done? Because we've done a lot for the galleries and the museums that we have, but there's one particular project that I think encapsulates a lot of what we're trying to do. It's a project at the National Gallery of Australia called Sharing the Collection. At any point in time, something like 98% of the artworks that we hold are in storage. Now, works get rotated through. Every art gallery will have works in storage, but 98%, the gallery said maybe they could find a way of sharing that collection with the rest of the country. And now there are works from First Nations artists that have returned to country where those stories speak to in the most personal way. There are works from other Australian artists that are finding their ways from a gallery in Canberra to a regional or suburban gallery. And there are some artists from some artworks from some of the best known artists in world history that are now hanging in galleries around Australia that were previously in storage. And I guess in what we've done with that speaks to, in a large part, what I hope for us to be able to do with cultural policy. I want us to have that focus on the artist where we are training and building up the capacity, just like we've backed in the training colleges over the course of this term, so that artists train, produce great work, and that great work then gets shared and reaches audiences around Australia. You know, when you reach an audience, it means that our music becomes a soundtrack to living in Australia. It means that our visual art, like the beautiful work I've got from Sally Scales behind me right now, that tells such a story of these last 3 years and goes back to stories much more ancient than that. That those works we can see them and they can stop us in our tracks. That those of you who are artists who work with language, be it through my loved poetry, or whether it be as screenwriters, as writers for the stage, or writers of other forms of literature, where in words you create what then hits our imagination, so that suddenly, simply by you creating those ideas, we can hear them, smell them, feel them. And similarly, for any art form, whether it's a performing art, through theatre, through dance, whether it is through music, as I mentioned, or whether it's through any art form out there, no matter who you are, if you have that sort of talent, your background shouldn't hold you back, your postcode shouldn't hold you back, disability shouldn't hold you back, the country of your heritage shouldn't hold you back. And we should be a country where those stories that speak to Australia can reach all Australians. It's how we see ourselves, it's how we learn about each other, it's how the world sees us. And through all of that, we get that little bit closer through cultural policy of being a nation where, because of your work as artists, we have a better and deeper understanding of so much, and you affect how we feel and how we dream. It's a big task. It's some of the biggest things I'll ever be associated with in my life. But effectively, I see my role as your minister, acknowledging you're the artists, I'm not. And my job is to make sure your volume's a bit louder, your spotlight's a little bit brighter, and to make sure that you can have a career that affects the nation and affects the lives of everyone who comes into contact with your work.